you for joining today's webinar. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. That's kind of a strange thing for me here to wish everybody a good morning. We've typically been doing these webinars during lunch hour, and then we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense for our audience. So we sent out a survey at the end of last month's webinar, and the overwhelming response was that people wanted to move to 10 o'clock in the morning. So we're going to do that for the foreseeable future and see what happens as far as the attendance. Again, my name is Bill Heaven. I'm a senior director here at HBK in our risk advisory practice. This afternoon, this morning, sorry, what habits are hard to break. I'm hoping we have what you find to be an interesting topic, and we want to talk a little bit about third-party risk. So we'll get going and go through the presentation that we have here this morning. All right. So this is our agenda for today. I'll also go through a few housekeeping or logistical issues so that everybody's familiar. So today's presentation is going to be available for 1 hour of CPE credit, but in order to obtain the CPE credit, you need to stay online for the entire webinar, and then we're going to have 4 questions embedded throughout the webinar that we'll be looking for you to answer. And then the 4th question actually is whether you want CPE or not. So all you have to do, if you want CPE, you don't have to reach out to us separately or anything like that. Just let us know that you want CPE, and we'll take care of it before you get the certificate mailed out. Now, we've muted all the incoming lines so we don't pick up any static or background. But if you are out, experiencing any technical difficulties, use the message center and do a chat. Michelle's monitoring that, so we'll try to address any issues that people are having. As well as there is a copy of our slide deck today that's included in the control center that you can download in the PDF version. And we are recording today's webinar, so if you want to pass it along to colleagues or anything, we will be sending out a follow-up after today's webinar that includes a URL to that meeting link. These are our learning objectives, which if you've been regularly attending our webinars, you'll recognize that it's one of the things we do to make sure we meet the qualifications or the requirements to be able to offer CPE to our attendees. So we've been doing this for probably at least 4 or 5 months now. So this is what I hope to achieve during today's webinar. And this is if you've attended regularly, you're probably getting tired of seeing this, my ugly mugshot up there in my bio. But I've been with HBK now since summer of 2018, and I have a dual role here at HBK. I handle both our internal firm IT security responsibilities, as well as work with clients on an external facing role for it varies. Some months it's more than others, but interesting role that I have here, so I'm happy to be in it. Now let's start diving into our topic here and go through the background regarding third-party risk. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. Get my notes here. All right, so starting out, third-party risk is definitely on the rise. The 3 main topics there being ways that the risk is rising. So we're gonna talk a little bit about these in detail. But if you think about it, everything you read about or hear about is how phishing emails are just on the rise, and if it's not ransomware, it's something else. But supply chain threats have been increasing. If everybody's probably remembers hearing about the SolarWinds attack, which that was considered a supply chain threat. The Log4j that we had Damon Hacker talk to us about in January, that was considered a supply chain uh, attack. Third-party breach costs are increasing. And then we have, it's just more and more getting reported how many organizations have experienced a breach because of a third party. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in depth as we go through the webinar today. So how do your vendors rate? It's a question that everybody should be able to answer. You've got different obligations that that your business partner / vendors should have to meet. Contractual, whether it's in the form of a SLA or service letter level agreement, so that they have to, possibly you've moved to a cloud provider and you need to ensure that you have the proper amount of uptime. It could be contractual. With all the regulations out there referring to, typically at the state level, you've got the CCPA out in California. So it doesn't mean that you're just located in California, but if you have customers in California, the CCPA is modeled after Europe's GDPR, where it starts getting into tracking things and allowing people to know what type of personal information you're compiling on them, and gives them the possibility of opting out or getting you to remove their data. So the security and privacy is increasing all the time, and states are coming up with more and more regulations that companies now have to provide. And again, it's not based on your location of your business. It's basically always comes down to where your customers are located. Ohio even had something on the books. I think it was about probably 6 months ago, but it seems to have stalled or died out. So there's nothing new on the horizon in Ohio regarding security or privacy, but that's constantly up for debate. The attack vectors, like I said, so we talked earlier a couple slides ago how the attacks are on the rise, and it's getting to be more and more issue. But you always got your hacking, like I said, phishing and ransomware. Ransomware is getting more and more dangerous. It used to just be that people would say, well, I've got good backups. Well, as we talked last month with our cyber hygiene, when I talked about ransomware, I reminded everybody that they're doing two things now that they didn't used to do. Number one, they're exfiltrating some of the data from your systems before they encrypt it, and then they're going to kind of like dangle that in front of you and say, hey, if you don't play ball with us, we're going to try to embarrass you by posting your PII type information for your customers out on websites. And the second thing they're doing is going through and trying to get into your systems enough that they can corrupt your backups, so that you don't have the ability to say, I'm not going to pay the ransom because I'm just going to revert back to my backup and use my business continuity / disaster recovery plan and get everything back up. And it's not going to be pain free, but I'm not going to have to pay X number of dollars to you, under the threat of extortion. So, but that's changing a little bit. Also, we'll talk more, but we've got the code signing, which if you're not aware, that's basically what they did with that SolarWinds attack. So the hackers got into the systems long enough where they could actually figure out how they could make it look like the malware that they were going to install into people's systems was actually valid, coming from the software provider. And then open source code, which is big buzzword, and a lot of people are using open source. The Linux operating system is technically an open source system, so those are becoming more compromised and becoming an issue as well. All right, so this is an interesting topic, and I've actually we deal with this internally a little bit. Is who's responsible for vendor risk? I mean, you could get some confusion because the two main choices are, the procurement company or information security, and kind of like you've probably at least thought this, or this has come up at your organization on the topic of cybersecurity. Who's responsible for cybersecurity? And the misnomer is that cybersecurity deals with computers, so it's IT's responsibility. So everybody always points a finger at IT and says, it's they're responsible for cybersecurity. The same exact thing happens with vendor risk. It's like, who wants to know about this risk? And why is IT making a big deal? So they must own it. So that's kind of like I said, a misnomer, and you need to vet that out within your organization, because it really is a business issue. Because if you look at third-party risk, which is excuse me, on the uptick, it will affect your IT department, but it's really a business thing, because your business will suffer and your business reputation will suffer. So vendor risk needs to be owned at the upper levels of management within the organization, just like cybersecurity does. So we'll talk more about that as we go through the webinar. Here are just the steps of third party, and again, we're going to circle through these. They're not repeats, but we're going to talk through them, and then I'm outlining them here, and then I'll talk about some of the risks, and then I'll talk about how you can put some processes in place to fix them. But these are just your general steps of doing your discovery, analysis, managing, prioritizing, and then actually trying to reduce the risk. And then this is kind of the tricky part, is like, how do you keep tabs on what's going on? Because that's always an issue that you get it done, you get your analysis done, and then you set it aside, and then bad thing can start happening. I'm talking to one company right now where actually a vendor, I'll get into it more in a little bit later into the presentation, but this person comes up with this bad example. He goes like, well, how do you know that the company isn't going to just eliminate their IT staff and they'll quote unquote outsource it, but it's going to a bunch of people that don't have any knowledge. And that, which you kind of on the surface you think that will never happen, but you kind of wonder. And I mean, he does have a point that type of action could happen. So it's you need to make sure you have the monitoring in place to know what's going on, and you can't just do your initial analysis and then forget it, because that's going to come back to haunt you. Okay, and here's Michelle's already loaded our first CPE question. So again, if you are looking for CPE, this is the first of the 4 that you'll have to answer. So Michelle, let me know when it looks like everybody's completed that. Okay, so let's move on to our next agenda item, and like I said, we'll circle back through here, and we'll talk about some of the risks of those 5 areas that we talked about. So again, we'll talk about the email or supply chain threats. So email is, like I said before, I might sound like a broken record, but phishing. And I think the latest stats are it's between high 80% range of cybersecurity attacks that happen because of phishing. And it's just like it. It's sad to say, but it it does work. So the hackers do what works, and they're working in that area where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So from their point of view, phishing emails work, so they'll keep doing it. Again, supply chain threats. This is new. It's a lot of if you've heard of an APT or an advanced persistent threat, which is typically by a nation state. Now, if you go back to SolarWinds, that was in theory the Russians, and now what we have going on over in Europe with the Russia-Ukraine situation, and then you're constantly getting the notifications from the government and the FBI that watch out that Russia's going to be doing cyber attacks. So these supply chain threats are usually more sophisticated, and you need a nation state. But since Russia was rumored to be behind SolarWinds, there could be something in the works. So it's good to probably keep our radar up to make sure what's going on. Third-party breach. If you notice, there's an IBM/Ponemon survey that comes out every year, talks about breaches. Well, just a general metric that's out there is that a cybersecurity breach is, and this is across all industries, it's running like high 3.9 million, almost 4 million, and that's in 2021. And basically, if a third party is involved, it's the stats that they keep specifically on third party breaches, which is happening more and more, is up by almost 400,000. So I've been hearing for probably 2 to 3 years now how third party is going to be the new quote unquote. We're going to be talking about third party risk because like we're talking about phishing for the past year or so. So it does seem like it's following what the experts have been saying, and it is increasing. And this stat that I got from the ISACA, which is the Information Systems Control and Auditing Group, is actually up. That 53% of organizations have gone on record to say that they've experienced a breach due to a third party. So that's actually pretty scary. So let's go on here. So how do your vendors meet? Again, this is what I was talking about with the SLAs and understanding how they're doing. Hopefully we've learned our lessons with what's gone on with the COVID-19 pandemic and how things are working with the supply chain. But so we're becoming more integrated all over the place. So we need to make sure that we understand that when we contract with another organization and outsource or insource or whatever kind of source they're going to call it, but you're going to be working with another organization and your business process is going to change. So you're going to want to know how to rank your vendors and how to understand if everything's working. You just don't want to come in and have a big mess on your hands. Talking about the attack types. So again, the code signing, I wanted to explain a little bit of what's going on with that. So everybody's probably seen the update when you're going to do, for example, you're going to do an update from Microsoft, and it asks you to download it. And before it downloads it, it does that little certificate check. Well, that's matching up the certificate that the authorities have online, the trust authorities have online, to who is Microsoft, and then they look at the certificate on the actual code, and they make sure that they match. So then it's like all good. But again, these advanced persistent threats, start going on, and they can get into the system. And if you remember, I've talked about a statistic called dwell time, which is how long a hacker can be inside your systems and have access to things before you even know they're there, which typically runs probably 8-9 months. So it takes you that long to know they're there, and then it takes you another few months to figure out what they did. But they can get there long enough and get it so they can make that credential check and the certificates match up so that you think. So that's actually what happened with SolarWinds is people thought they were getting a valid update from the SolarWinds source code, but it was actually malware. So additionally, we've got stuff going in with open source, which this one's a little bit more tricky. I haven't actually heard of a breach, but they're listing it as one of the main attack vectors. I would think this one would be a little bit more hard to pull off because one of the advantages to open source is that you've got a bunch of different eyes looking at something. So you would think that it's going to be harder to code malware into an open source program than just doing the code signing, which I think would be much easier to do. And like I said, we've got examples of the SolarWinds and the Log4j that were actually examples of code signing and on the supply chain vector. Again, who owns the risk? What's the risk of this? And it's basically if you've got everybody pointing fingers at everybody else and you haven't assigned a responsibility, you're basically in that no man's land, so to speak, where bad things happen. So you really need to have somebody own vendor risk. And when I talk about the suggestions and controls, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Third-party steps. I'm going to go through this in some detail right at the near the end before we get into the wrap-up stage. But so the big thing is that you need to consider here is if you don't have a formalized process, then basically you don't have a process. So if you don't have steps that you expect your personnel to follow, they're not going to follow anything because they don't even consider this a risk. So that the big risk is that you need a process or else you're going to suffer the consequences. All right, so I think this is our next CPU question. So Michelle, let me know when we. Okay, let's all right, let's move on to the suggestions. So, all right, again, so we'll talk about what we can do about this third-party risk being on the rise. So my two biggest takeaways for this area would be that work to establish some type of governance. Now you don't need this to be terribly formalized, but put some things in place. Put some policies in place that say basically we only want people to have access to the minimum things that they need to be able to do their job. You don't want to make it difficult for you to conduct business, but you don't want to give everybody admin rights so that when somebody clicks on a phishing email, that the person that wrote that code has the ability to install software and change configurations and just do all kinds of stuff through your systems. And the big other thing would be to monitor the regulation as to if things are coming on the horizon, if your privacy and or security requirements, and that's typically going to be at a state level, have changed that, to make things that you have to worry about. You also have to keep in mind things like if you accept credit cards, you need to be PCI compliant. So make sure you understand what that means. But so basically, just don't stick your head in the sand about IT. Start to pay attention to these things. If you don't have the capability to do that, you can attend these webinars. We're going to try to keep you up to date on things that are happening locally as well as what's up throughout the whole U.S. And just get yourself a source of information. There's things out there. FBI has a regular, they call it a flash. There's I'll talk, I think I got it coming up on a couple later slides, is the CISA from the federal government. They put out some notifications all the time. So there's ways to keep up with it without spending a whole heck of a lot of time, but it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor. And then what should you do when you're visiting vendors rate to see how they rate? Again, monitoring is key. So again, design some SLAs into your process, service level agreements. Make sure that they have to do certain performance things. They have to keep their website or your application up and running. They need to make sure that they're doing backups for you or whatever it may be. But you need to make sure you keep tabs on what's going on. Okay, like I said, figuring out what's going on. Again, I talked about the FBI flash reports. CISA, which I mentioned before, is by the federal government. Their website is www.cisa.gov. And CISA stands for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So that's a very good website to go to. I highly recommend it. Make sure that that's actually where you're at and that somebody hasn't sent you a phishing email and sent you somewhere else. But there's a lot of free resources out there. It can help you do things like risk assessments, and they're going to talk about the latest phishing scams and different things you can do there. But that's all provided by the U.S. federal government, and it is free. So if you have questions about it, you can talk with me or someone from HBK that they'll probably point you back to me. But there's some good stuff you can do without having to just hire somebody all the time. You can take advantage of what they've already put out there for you. Okay, so again, I talked about what the lawlessness that can happen if you don't have a proper vendor risk management process, formalization policies. But I would definitely, it talks here about procurement or information security. I would actually say that it should be up at the highest levels of management. It should work to own this, to give you some clout, so to speak. So it's probably somebody, if your organization is big enough, somebody in the C level. If not, it could be your president, working to make sure that somebody at the highest level of the organization has ways to chime in. Like, for example, internally here, it's our chief operating officer that basically owns the vendor risk. We go through a whole bunch of stuff that says, here's what we're going to do for risk management, but it's not me and IT that makes the decision. It's not the person that comes to me that says, hey, I want to use this vendor to do this great new thing. We do the evaluation, working with the other person, the project manager, the business manager, and we work it through our criteria. And then it's actually the COO who's responsible for risk in our organization that makes the call on that. So it's kind of like a tiebreaker, because if you look at it, it's me against the quote unquote business project owner that wants to do this thing. So they definitely want to do it. So it works out where we've kind of got a built-in tiebreaker there. Okay. So then talking about, I've been hinting to this for a while, but there's a bunch of different ways to go through this. So what I've done, these are the 5 main areas that I would think that you're going to need. Basically the discover, analysis, manage and quantify, prioritize and treat, and then again, the monitoring. So I'll talk about these a little bit in detail. So the discover phase. So really the main things that are important there, and I'll go back to what I've put in place internally here for us at HBK, is first thing you have to do is you have to have a data classification process, set of rules, policy, procedure, whatever you want. But the first thing is to classify your data and do it by sensitivity. So everybody's got their classified, or maybe it's called restricted information. So you have to know what types of data you have as an organization and what's the most important. So if you don't have that, then everything else kind of falls apart. So you understand what data you have out there, and then understand what these vendors are going to do with your data. And obviously you can categorize your vendors based on what type of data or what type of access they're going to have that they're going to process in the system. So you do that. Then you need some type of framework to evaluate the vendor / what they're going to have, which is, you definitely want that to be as objective as possible. You don't want a subjective thing. Now, what I put together here is we have a list of controls based on what we would like to see our vendors have. And obviously, the more risky the information they're handling, the more of those controls they need to have in place. So it's just like if you've got a certain vendor that is dealing with maybe it's IBM, but IBM has ventured out and they're going to be selling pencils. So if you're working with IBM where they're just supplying you with pencils, you need to understand that, and then you wouldn't classify IBM as risky of a vendor. Whereas if you're outsourcing a website to IBM that's handling your healthcare information, then that's obviously a bigger deal, and you want to be cognizant of that. So again, I talked before about have some type of tiebreaker set up so that you know who needs to be the one that's going to make this decision. And it shouldn't come back down to that cybersecurity type thing where IT turns into the scapegoat. Because I worked at some larger organizations and people kind of like to see that happen if they're the one requesting, because they don't want to have to make the call to whether they do the business. They say like, well, IT said it was okay, or IT security said it was okay. And the biggest thing in this discover phase is people and I run into this all the time at past jobs, where people just automatically assume that because a company is large, that they're secure. Now, this was at a previous company that I worked at. There was a group that was getting ready to do business with Amazon Web Services, and they just automatically started digging into it and trying to figure out how secure the web Amazon's environment was going to be for what we were going to use it for. And people who were running the project just thought everything was automatically in there and turned on. And we dug and dug and dug, and we found out that the end result was, yeah, they have the capability to do that, but unless you turn it on, the capability isn't there. So you really have to dig to understand what's going on. And just because an organization is large or they have a reputation, that they're secure, that can change at any moment, and you just need to make sure you do the due diligence and dot your I's and cross your T's. The next step, the analyze, is really, again, it's important to evaluate how this vendor is going to integrate into your business processes. I gave that real half phony, convoluted type example with IBM venturing into selling pencils versus websites. But it's a pretty simplistic example, but it is important because depending on how you're doing the using that vendor, it's going to make a big difference. So make sure you know how they're going to be used, and then you can categorize them as far as risk. And like I said, our process that we use here, if it's a higher risk, they're going to be handling higher classifications of data, more sensitive data, have access to our systems, then we're going to want to see all of those controls that we evaluate. Whereas if they're on the other end, the pencil end of the equation, maybe we only need to see a third of the controls, because it's still our reputation on the line. And that's a very crucial thing to keep in mind, that if something goes bad, because your company has outsourced part of its business processes to a third party, and that third party has a problem, your customers only know that they had a problem, that their data was impacted. They're still going to come back and blame you. So that's your fault. They're not going to take the answer that, well, it wasn't our fault, it was our vendor's fault, because they're going to come back and say, well, why did you choose to do business with that vendor? So it really comes back to you. So you need to know what's going on, and make sure it's your job to be as responsible as possible with your customers' data. And then lastly, in the analyze, you're going to want to make sure you understand, number one, how you're going to be doing this assessment, what you're going to bounce it up against, and then how you're going to communicate the results of that. So as I said earlier, get somebody that's going to be responsible for making the final call, but you have to have the information presented in a manner so that you can give that person the facts that they need to be able to make that decision. So then you talk about moving on to the next step, the manage and quantify. That's really your risk quantification. So you want to be able to assign a risk score so that you can work through. And it's very important to do, because again, a lot of people are going to just say, well, this is a big company and they have a lot of business, so they're not going to want to do anything bad, or they're good, so we don't really have anything to worry about. But I try to, in the roles that I've played in IT security, I've tried to make it, again, objective. So, for example, if I'm looking for a situation where I need to have eyes on a situation, so a lot of people will do this when they do vendor risk. It's, okay, I want to do a questionnaire. So I'm going to send out a questionnaire to a company and have them fill that out. Well, how do you know the answers that they're giving you are accurate? How do you know that the person that's answering your questions is even the right person that should be doing that for you? I mean, dumb example that I kind of alluded to before, but that security questionnaire, is it being completed by the CIO or the equivalent of the organization, or did it make it to the intern that's working in IT for the summer, and that person fills out the questionnaire? So that's, you're putting a lot of faith in that questionnaire. You need to figure out how valid it is. So it's important to understand. I'm going to give a lot more credibility to if I have like a SOC report where an independent accounting firm has gone through and done evaluation and put in their assessment as to whether those controls really work. Or I've gone to the site myself and audited the security function and looked to see that they say they have IT policies, but do they actually have IT policies? So that's a big thing too, to see, are you just trusting, or have you got some eyes on it, or you have a mechanism in place where somebody that's got an independent, they don't have any skin in the game, their job is just to give you a judgment. Has that been done? So how valid is that information that's coming back? Moving on to, you want to make sure you get that score and make sure it's documented. And that's what I always do, because things change. And just for example, here internally, I did an evaluation for a vendor back probably about 6 months ago. It came up with one judgment, but I made sure I wrote everything down so that we had a marker in the sand, because actually I just got a refresh that just came into my inbox this week that says, hey, some things have changed, so we want you to reassess this vendor. So now I don't have to start from zero. I can go back and see where they were 6 months ago, look at the new information and how that delta has changed. So based on the fact that documented copy exists, I have a basis. So that's good. Making sure that you have, being that it's documented, it also gives you a way to do specific mitigation procedures to know that something has been done there. So you either have to say that vendor's not worth working with, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z to mitigate the risk. And then we're going to put those things in place. So you want as many controls as you can in your prioritize and treatment step to make sure that you're creating a secure environment. Now that could be, again, this gets a little bit, and I'll talk about it more in monitoring, but what I've seen done a lot is you can at least put requests into a contract. Again, Microsoft's probably going to say, no, we're not going to modify our contract for you. But a lot of vendors will say, yeah, I was working on one for the last month where we've probably added 5 or 6 clauses to their terms of service agreement based on things that we wanted to see happen that they weren't currently doing. And they agreed to do that. So that gives us at least some legal standing that if something goes bad, we can at least go back and try to get some judgment out of that if things would go bad, which hopefully they never do, but at least it gives you something. And the threat out there is often enough to keep a business on the up and up, so to speak. Talking about the last step, the monitoring, that's probably the biggest thing. The other thing I alluded to before, make sure you're reassessing these, because like I just described, the one where they want me to do the refresh after 6 months, this stuff is changing all the time. And I definitely say if it's one of your critical category vendors, you should be looking at them at least annually, if not continuously. And there are some things that are out there, and I'll talk about them in a second. But you can get an independent, quote unquote, assessment or viewpoint or opinion, and that's maybe it's a SOC 2 by a CPA firm, maybe it's an ISO certification from the ISO function, which is a global function. The other thing you need to understand is how many resources are going to be involved with doing this monitoring. So do you have to have people, like I said before, go out to the site and actually audit it? And there's actually some things you can do that talk about these rating services. If anybody's ever heard of organizations, 2 of the big players are BitSite, which give you like a credit score type ranking where you get between, I think it's 400 and 900. There's also a security scorecard where they do more like the grade school report card where you get an A through F on the different areas. So there's those that are they'll give you an independent viewpoint, track people's security posture. But there's this possible, and it gives you a little bit of a different viewpoint than just sending out a questionnaire. Um, but the questionnaire is probably, it's a very valid tool, and it happens a lot. And I would imagine that a lot of companies are going to start to get more and more questionnaires as other people start to figure out that these rating services are actually a thing to be, and the security and third party risk is something to be concerned with. So I think we have another polling question here. Okay, I noticed that a typo in that last question. So that last one was supposed to be Samsung. Hopefully nobody chose that one anyway, but sorry about that. So again, third party risk, big topic, going to be bigger as we go on in the future. So I hope I gave people some valuable information on the topic. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But I think we're going to move on to our Q&A section. Oh, first, we're going to do our last polling question. Again, this is the one where you decide if you want CPE or not. This is probably the toughest question of the batch. Okay, so now we'll move on to our Q&A section. Hopefully you found today's presentation informative and worthwhile. Explored a lot of details about third-party risk management. Again, if you have questions, reach out to me. My email is up on the screen there, or that's our phone number here at the Canfield HBK office. So we've saved a few minutes, so I'm not sure if we got how many questions we had come in, but we'll go through those. And if we don't get a chance to answer your question, we'll reach out to you directly. So again, thank you for attending today's webinar, and we hope you found it valuable. And we'll be sending out an invite. Our April webinar will be held on Wednesday, the 27th. Again, we're going to be at this 10 o'clock time slot. Michelle, do we have any questions?
Yes. The first question that came in was, do I really need to worry about vendor security posture or working with large companies?
So again, I kind of talked about that in the actual presentation when we talked about the former company I worked with, where we're going to do the project with Amazon. But I would say, yeah, because you got to make sure maybe they have it, but they're not configuring it. And then the other thing to just keep in mind, if you look back and think of some of the largest breaches that we've talked about lately, I mean, just a few of them. You got the Target breach, you have there's an Anthem breach, there's a Home Depot breach. So those are some of the biggest names in their respective industries, and they were breached. So again, just because it's Microsoft, I hear the argument all the time. Well, Microsoft's not going to do anything they want to keep their business. They don't want to, alienate any customers. Well, that you still have to do your due diligence and make sure that they're secure. Keep in mind that Bill Gates is disliked by a lot of in the hacking world. So people go after Microsoft just because it's Microsoft. So you really need to keep in mind that just because a company is large, and don't assume that they're secure just because they're a big company. Any other questions, Michelle?
Yes. The next question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge regarding the third-party risk moving forward?
Um, that's a tough one, I would say, because I would say it is definitely real, and it's definitely going to be increasing. So obviously, the one of the biggest challenges is going to be how to have an efficient process that you're going to be able to fully resource up. So you don't want to be creating a process that's going to, um, break down on you. And everybody's seen how reliant we are on other outside companies through all the stuff that we're dealing with continually with the supply chain stuff through the COVID thing. So figuring out how to make these things work efficiently. So I'm thinking that's where things come in, like I talked about, maybe bringing in artificial intelligence of those types of processes are put more into place. You've got rating services that can, deal with parts of it, like I talked about, a security scorecard or a bit site. So those are some of the things that I would say are the biggest challenges, and some of the ways that we might be able to address them going forward.
I think we have
Any
one
other
more
questions?
time. We have time for one more that just came in. And how can
Okay.
HBK help me with my third-party risk?
All right. So yeah, that is actually, I'll give you the caveat of it depends, but it depends on what you're experiencing as far as, again, and I said that this is probably going to happen more and more where you're going to be asked by your customers and some of your vendors as to what your security posture is. So we can definitely assist you with helping to establish your IT governance. Now, whether that means, helping you to put some policies in place, helping you to understand what type of data you have and how you should classify it, what vendor categories you have. Obviously, phishing campaigns continue to go up, so we have phishing simulation campaigns which we could help with. If you are getting a lot of fielding a lot of surveys yourself, I mean, I talked with a client, recently that said they had a person spending at least 25 to 30% of their time every month, addressing security questionnaires. If that's the case, then we could come in and do a SOC 2 report for you, which will assess your control environment, put it into report format, and then you can turn around and share that report with the people instead of completing that questionnaire, and you can free up that person that's spending 25 to 30% of their time, answering questionnaires. You can just give them the SOC report. Additionally, we've got vulnerability scanning, different things we can do to help with your overall posture. But doing training with helping you with governance, doing a SOC 2, depending on if you're at that stage. And a lot of people aren't at that. Smaller companies don't really need to worry about the SOC 2, but as you grow, that and as third-party risk gets more noted, it's to be a bigger thing on people's plate. It's going to happen more and more. Any others, or was that the last one?
That was the last one for now.
All right. So again, thanks for attending today. Hopefully you found this valuable, and we're going to be talking about some specific Microsoft things with a member of our Vertilocity group next on April, I believe it's April 27th, and we'll be sending out invites here in the very near future. So thanks for attending, and everybody have a great day, and enjoy your lunch since we're not doing this over our lunch hour this time. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.